Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Babylon Cast. As always, I'm your host, Vern Freeman, and today I'm joined once more by the illustrious Dr. Eric Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman, how are you doing today?
Great to be here. Thanks, Vincent.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming back on. The first time we spoke, we had a conversation about academic freedom in the university system. And I think that was a very informative conversation. And hopefully, a lot of people got out of that conversation the same things that I felt like I got out of it. And for today, one of the things that we sort of mentioned at the very end of that podcast, something that I wish that we would have spoken on, is your arguments in regard to the religious inheriting the earth, where um, it's a very popular belief, especially among these sort of secular and new atheist circles, that they'll often cite studies that show that the nuns are rising exponentially, that secularization is becoming more popular. And so I did want to touch upon that, but unfortunately we didn't. And luckily we get to touch upon that topic today. But first and foremost, would you mind giving a rundown of who you are? What are the topics that you sort of are interested in? What are your academic credentials? So that way people can, follow you on all your socials, of course.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, I've been an academic now since the late '90s. What I'm mainly interested in is issues around either ethnicity and nationalism or around religion, and particularly as they intersect with population change or demography. So, what's called political demography, how population change affects society and politics, is sort of a major area that I've worked on, and I've co-edited a book called Political Demography with Jack Goldstone and Monica Toft, and also written a number of books, including Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, which is really about the, if you like, the demography of religion, the political demography of religion. And so it's asking, how does population change shape religious trends, which also means it's shaping the secularization debate. Because I think that the secularization debate has largely been conducted by sociologists and almost in isolation, focusing heavily on Western countries, not slightly broadening it out in some cases, but generally focusing on social trends in Western countries. With surveys that often have very limited representation, let's say from non-Christian immigrant groups or diasporas, and also some of the sort of religious sects that are harder to survey. So what I try to do is kind of bring in, I'm not rejecting, in fact, I largely accept the secularization argument. But my point is that you can have secularization, you can have a society where people are always moving from religion to non-religion, but the share of the population that is religious is rising continually because of demographic change. An example would be the globe that we're in right now. The world has become more religious, even as the direction of flow has probably been more of religion to non-religion than the other way around.
Mhm.
But because all the world's, essentially 97% of the world's population growth is in the highly religious parts of the world, and the population aging and decline is largely in the non-religious parts of the world, then therefore the world as a whole becomes more religious, because most people get religion the old-fashioned way, through birth. And that simply means that more religious babies, kind of quote unquote, are being born, then you're going to get the rise of a religious population, even without there being a religious revival, let's say secular people suddenly finding religion. So that's sort of the gist of the argument, and it's, it has been echoed to some degree in some previous work. So Pippa Norris and the late Ron Inglehart had a book called Sacred and Secular, which more or less said, okay, well, yes, we can see that the world is becoming more religious because of population trends, but eventually the rest of the world will do what the West has done, and we'll start to see religious decline. So that is another argument, right, that says, well, the secularization is largely taken place in the West, and in fact, someone like Steve Bruce, who's a leading secularization theorist, said, well, no, my theory doesn't apply outside the West, so don't judge me on what's happening outside the West. Um, Norris and Engelhardt tried to expand the theory to cover the globe. So they said, okay, well, we don't really see these trends yet, but it's happening in a few places at the edges, and we'd expect it to happen in the future.
And in conversations surrounding the question of whether or not the United States is a Christian nation or whether or not it's a secular nation, a lot of people seem to, well, they need to bring up the fact that there's two versions of secularism, and you mentioned this in your book as well. There's sort of the religious piety of the individual versus the way in which the institutions manifest themselves. Would you mind giving also a rundown of the difference between a secular society versus secular individuals?
Right. So you can sort of compare, let's say, Europe and America on this. So the separation of church and state, let's say the religious institutions and political institutions, that is sort of, if you like, one kind of secularization. And so that's compatible with a highly religious society in terms of personal belief, attendance, and whatnot. And that, so actually, a lot of commentators will say, well, the United States is very secular because of this separation, but it's highly religious because of the relatively high religious observance of the population. Whereas Europe, you have established churches, you have, say, Anglican bishops sitting in the House of Lords. You have this meshing of religious and political institutions, and the influence of religious institutions is still sort of there. Not really, but technically there in Lutheran countries and Anglican countries and so on. But religious piety is quite low in terms of the population in many European countries. So that's a kind of neat little illustration of the two types of secularization. One might be saying, well, we're going to disestablish the Church of England, the bishops are out of the House of Lords. That would be a kind of secularization, and that's occurred to some degree in Europe over time, where religious authorities have lost power over secular functions like welfare provision and marriages and certain things. So there has been a sort of loss of institutional power, which you could call one form of secularization. And then the second thing is this loss of individual observance and piety, which is sort of secularism too. And that's kind of what I focus mainly on in the book. I don't really look at, how much religious institutions have or have not lost power. I do look at it a little bit, but it's not the central focus.
Right. Yeah. And so, you mentioned something that you largely think, you're largely convinced by the secularization thesis. You do think, at least at the very least in the West, and that's the way that I've always viewed it. One of the arguments made by some of the earlier sociologists in the late 60s, Peter Berger, was that even in the West, it's not as obvious as you should see, as many people would claim. And he used two countries to justify that argument. One is the fact that you see a country like Japan, which is highly modernized, but still very religious. And the second one is the United States, in which the United States is a very modernized country, but again, also very highly religious. And I've always had very big issues with that reasoning because, one, even though Japan is largely, you're either a Buddhist or a Shinto in Japan, the way in which they practice religion is very, very different from the way one would expect one would practice religion. And I tried looking at the studies, and there's very few studies to show this, but from the people that I've spoken with who live in Japan, they'll say they practice it in a very cultural and traditional manner. If you were to ask them, do you literally believe that you're worshiping your ancestors and they're aware of it? They'll say no. They're very atheistic in that sense. It's much more traditional and much more cultural. And with the United States, again, he said this in the late 60s. Even now, we're seeing the rise of the nuns in the United States where people are leaving religion. So do you think even the criticisms that people such as Berger have, and to some extent also Weber, their arguments that even in the West, the secularization thesis doesn't hold because of countries like Japan and the United States, do you think those arguments hold any water?
I'm relatively skeptical. I mean, I do think the US for a long time had higher religious observance than other, particularly Northern European Protestant majority type societies. And there may be something I mean, there have been many attempts to test the idea that if you have more religious diversity, so the argument of the so-called religious markets or supply side. The counter argument to the secularization thesis was that the United States, uh, because it had a religious free market rather than a state monopoly religion, it was more dynamic, and so the providers in this marketplace, instead of one Soviet department store, you had all these shops selling different versions of religion. They could cater to different types of demand, and therefore it was more dynamic, and therefore people were more religious because they could find something that agreed with them. And I don't think there is nothing to that, but I think a lot of the empirical studies have not borne out that argument very well. So there are some countries in Europe, like Greece, that has, or Italy, who have relatively higher religiosity than countries in Northern Europe that might allow more, have more religious diversity. So it just doesn't seem like there's solid evidence, other than the case of the US, which of course did have religious innovation. It did have immigrant groups coming in, bringing in their own ethnic churches, and maybe there, it had all of these factors which play some role, but I'm not 100% convinced of the exceptionalism. Now, I mean, the US is sort of like, it was certainly considerably more religious, like 40% weekly attendance. Canada, Australia were sort of in the middle compared to Europe. And within Europe, you had, some countries, initially the Catholic countries were somewhat more religious than the Protestant countries, and so on. So you did have these gradations, and I think there is something to it, but I don't think it changes the fundamental picture of what drives secularization, which Steve Bruce talks about in his writings, which is to do with essentially the fragmentation of society through the Industrial Revolution, which shrinks the number of functions that religion ministers to, such as recreation, welfare state, leisure, all these things. More and more of these functions are being taken up by the marketplace of the state. So
Mhm.
there's less really that religion plays a smaller and smaller role in people's lives. And also the sort of expressive individualism, which leads people to break away from established traditions and institutions. And there's also, of course, there is this the scientific rationality, which tends to play a role. Not, although Bruce didn't emphasize that, he more emphasized the structural stuff. But I think that all matters, and I think those forces in Western countries are all fairly important in eroding, in eroding the power of religion and the attractiveness of religion. So I guess I sort of subscribe more to the secularization theory, and of course, what's happened in the U.S. since 2000 or since the late 90s has borne that out. I remember I had a year in Harvard, and I was speaking to Robert Putnam before he come out with his book with Campbell on American Grace, which is about the trends in U.S. religion. And Putnam had identified that the youngest generation was sort of 35-40% unaffiliated, and his explanation was sort of, well, it's a backlash against the religious right, and essentially suggesting that that was a kind of one-off period effect, and we'd go back to some kind of normal. And I was sort of saying, no, I think this is sort of baked in because of the expressive individualism and the whole cultural set of attitudes that are in these younger generations, and the way they've been reared and all these sorts of things. So I think I probably got the better of that. I don't want to brag, because Putnam's done a lot of amazing work and I'm a huge fan, but I don't think the argument that this was just a sort of backlash against the 1980s, 90s religious right is really convincing. These trends are durable now over quite a few years. So yeah, and of course in Europe we see, at least in the Catholic higher religious countries, we see a waning in the Irelands and Italies, and so we do see that Spain, for example, all of them are having religious decline. And so I think the general pattern in the West, and now increasingly in parts of Latin America as well, particularly the southern cone of Latin America, you're seeing it's not just about Pentecostal revival, it's also now non-religion is growing, and perhaps even in parts of North Africa. So there is, I think, certainly good evidence for the secularization thesis. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I will. I'm inclined also to believe that. You touched upon there the effects that modernity has on religion and why secularization is occurring because of modernity, because the functions that religion would normally provide are becoming narrower and narrower, and also its explanatory value is becoming narrower and narrower. In recent years, there's been this resurgence of religious apologetics by the likes of people like Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray, also to some extent, where they argue that one of the functions of religion that has not been getting narrower and narrower is the fact that it deals with existential anxieties for people. It's the sort of spiritual aspect of it. That's one function of religion that cannot be replicated in a modernized society. Um, from my standpoint, I look at that and I say that is definitely a positive aspect of religion that doesn't seem to be provided by the market or by modernization, but it's not powerful enough for religion to stay alive. What are your thoughts on that one aspect of religion?
Well, what I would say is I don't think when you say stay alive, I'm certainly I would say that the extinction of religion, I would not see or foresee that. I mean, even without the demography, I just think that that's unlikely because the trend that we see is actually a splintering of a hollowing out of the traditional religions, the mainline traditions, if you like, Catholicism or Lutheranism or Anglicanism, these kind of mainline, or in the U.S. it would be the established Episcopalians and Baptists and so on. I mean, that established religion is completely imploding, and it's happening to some extent in Judaism as well. But yes, non-religion is growing, but also the more, call it, fundamentalist groups are either not losing numbers or growing, and so they have a different trajectory, and I think they are not about to decline, or really, they're not going the same way as the mainstream religions. So I think it's a bit of a more complex picture, but the overall numbers are definitely declining in some countries. In some places, it's more or less plateaued. Like Northern Europe is not getting more secular. It's just you're down to 5% weekly attendance. I don't think that's going to drop to zero. I think it'll stay at 5 or go higher. I don't think it's going to go lower. So there's kind of a floor, I think, to this process. But yeah, I think that so that the supply side anti-secularization argument is people have a need for religion, and it's just down to whether the providers are catering to that need, right? So, and I think I agree with them that there is this need, but where I disagree and where I would sort of go with the secularization argument is I think people can suppress that drive, that need. They can kind of repress these big questions, if you like,
Hmm.
almost till they die. So I don't think that's a convincing argument to say, well, we got to have religion because kind of people need it. Well, yeah, they may have the need, but they can suppress that need, and
Hmm.
we do that a lot in daily life with other things. We may want to steal that watch from that store or whatever. We have to kind of repress those drives. Um, so I don't think it's inconceivable to just imagine religion declining. Now, on the other hand, of course, in some of these surveys, we see, younger people, they're less attached to religion, but they're more likely to believe in life after death and reincarnation. And so, undoubtedly, that sort of spiritualism has been deflected into other expressions. I think that's definitely true. And there are also popularity of the occult, horoscopes. Although I think there's been studies that show New Age spirituality has not taken off. It's been pretty flat as well.
Hmm.
So I think just yoga studios, that's not religion. I'm sorry. I mean, people play around with the definition of religion. Going to watch the Red Sox, no, okay, that's not. It may have some functions that are similar, but I don't think you can call that religion. Um, which is what Steve Bruce also says. There has to be some connection to the otherworldly in order for us to really call this religion. Uh, but Peterson and Murray, I mean, they make a number of points around religion about how, I mean, the connection to wokeness, for example. And this is a tricky one. I do think there probably is some connection, but I'm not sure it's a strong one because we've had religious decline, and certainly in Europe, we've had it, well before we saw the takeoff of things like wokeness. And it's just that other ideologies, such as socialism or nationalism, were more popular, anarchism. So I think yes, there will be secular religions, but I think that looking at wokeness as a sort of substitute religion that has arisen simply because of the collapse of religiosity amongst Zoomers and millennials in the U.S., I think is too simplistic. I think it's more to do with a sort of loss of national traditions, actually, and those sorts of traditions. Although I think loss of religious tradition is part of it, but these other more ascribed traditional identities, as those have kind of receded, these trans ethnic kind of more presentist lifestyle based kind of subcultural things such as wokeness have kind of emerged more strongly. So I do think there is some substitution going on, but it's more like one secular religion replacing another secular religion. I think
Mhm,
that's how I would read it.
mhm. Yeah, Yuval Noah Harari makes a similar argument where he says, words like nationalism shouldn't be used as a dirty word because, the goods that come from it, as you've said.
Mm.
Um, Now, we've largely been talking about secularism in Western countries, but the big thing that sort of we should probably raise our eyebrows at is in developing countries. What are the rates of religiosity in developing countries? What trajectory are they headed towards? You said in your book that if they do modernize, they will modernize in the American version of sort of marketplace of religion, and it's still fragmented, rather than the European version. Um, the book says that the type of religiosity that is increasing, as you stated earlier, is a very fundamental version of religion, a very literalist approach, a very fundamentalist approach. Would that be an accurate assessment for the developing countries?
Okay, so there are different things going on. I mean, the fundamentalism is a different point, let's say, from the developing country religiosity. Um, in secularization theory, there's an argument called the cultural defense theory, which says, well, when you have, let's say, a Northern Ireland, where it's about Protestants against the Catholics now, or let's just say British versus Irish, but the marker is religion. So what that does is it actually gives religion a secular job to do as a marker of ethnic identity, right? So, or if it's a marker of nationalism, a marker of being Polish against the Russians is being Catholic, let's say, or the marker of being Irish against the British is being Catholic. Well, when there's a job, a secular job to do as a marker, a boundary marker of ethnic or national identity, then that gives religion a relevance and a contemporary relevance, according to Bruce, that keeps it vital. And I think you can make that argument, let's say, for many parts of the developing world. So, for example, the Muslim world, it could be, well, we're against the West, and part of our identity as Saudi Arabia or Iran is being, or Pakistan, is that we're Muslim, and therefore it's a symbol of national identity. Orthodoxy, a symbol of Greek identity. One of the reasons perhaps Orthodoxy, I haven't looked at the recent numbers in terms of Greece and religious belief, but one of the reasons it might be stronger is perhaps that identification between Orthodoxy and Greekness in relation to the Turks, let's say. And so whenever you have these nationalist ethnic conflicts or tensions or identities, that can give religion a lease on life. So another example would be non-Christian immigrant groups in Europe. In the census in England and Wales, we can look at Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim identification, and you can see that there is almost no if you want to call secularization, people ceasing to identify as Muslim or as Hindu or as Sikh, and within those groups, you see very little drop off in religious attendance, like almost nothing. And that would be explained by, well, being Sikh, Muslim, or Hindu in Britain against the secular mainstream it props up your ethnic identity as Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian, whatever. And so it's kind of cool and relevant for young people, and you're not going to lose the religious attachments or attendance or belief. And so I think that explains a certain amount of what's happening in the developing world. Like for Sri Lanka not to be Buddhist. I mean, Buddhism is so wrapped up with their national identity, Hinduism with the Indian national identity. Because of that connection between these identities, even the secularization theory, I think, could kind of come to terms with the idea that India would not become a non-religious country in the same way that England would be. So I think one of the things that's happening is national identity and ethnic identity are bolstering religiosity in many parts of the developing world through a kind of cultural opposition defense process. But that's not the only thing. Also, so that is maybe one explanation. However, I do think that even beyond that, I do think the developing world, let's leave Latin America, which has many European characteristics and is to some degree following, I would say, increasingly to some degree following the European model, at least the more European origin parts of Latin America, like Argentina, Uruguay, Chile. And so there is some religious decline, considerable religious decline in quite a number of these Latin American countries. Not as extreme as in Europe, but it's there. So that's a partial exception. But I think if we take the non-Christian world, it's still very difficult to really see people saying, I identify as atheist.
Hmm.
Some evidence from North Africa, but it's very hard to know how good that data is. And I think that's a challenge for the secularization argument. And so I think Norris and Engelhardt, who were claiming that, as people get more affluent, they would say, well, people aren't yet affluent and safe enough. Once they are, but it's I think difficult to make a claim that the United Arab Emirates or Brunei or some of these wealthy places are not wealthy and secure, and that that's the only reason that they are religious. I think it's kind of, you could say it for a poor country like Egypt perhaps, but to say it for the wealthy Arab countries is I think a stretch. So I actually think the non-Christian world is a bit of a problem for the secularization thesis. I think you can kind of claim certain reasons why it hasn't happened yet, but I do think, yes, I would agree it does pose some challenges to, why wouldn't you see more religious decline amongst the Indian middle class? I think there probably, according to the theory, there probably should be some decline, and I don't think we see it.
Hmm. Yeah, the response to secularism in those non-Christian countries in the Middle East, let's say, it seems that the fundamentalist response to secularism could be because they've used secularism as a Western phenomenon. And so there's the political aspect there in which they want to reject that. But there's also, is there also a religious aspect to it? Because that's one of the biggest debates of whether or not a lot of this extremist manifestation of religion is a byproduct of Western imposition onto these countries, or is there also some truth to the fact that you also see a lot of this response from their texts? What are your sort of thoughts on there?
Yeah, so fundamentalism is really about religious innovation. It's not tradition. It's innovating to mark out clearer red lines between your religion and either other religions or secularism. And so it's typically arisen in a case such as in India, the whole Deobandi movement, and all of this was really about worrying about syncretism with Hinduism and borrowing. And so it was about saying, no, here are some pure fundamentals which are very different from Hinduism, and we don't want to get involved in syncretism. Or it could be the fundamentalism, you say Protestant fundamentalism, I think was a reaction against modernism, ecumenism, and secularism in sort of late 19th, early 20th century the United States and elsewhere. So I think that's part of it, is about sort of drawing these firm, clear lines. Jewish fundamentalism, again, same sort of thing. Fetishizing the black hats, the dress, that was actually not traditional Jewish teaching. These were innovations to try and, you want to make your group look funny to the mainstream. You want to maximize the difference to erect barriers to the outside world. So these are actually modern innovations that are about drawing red lines and sort of focusing on a few precepts out of 200 and some odd, or just really, these are the ones that count, and we're going to elevate the ones that are most anti-modern, like not using a car, or women not staying at home and just having kids, whatever it may be, deliberately trying to sort of draw a line against modernity and reject world denying. Not that all are incredibly world denying, but so I think that's sort of the process behind fundamentalism. Now, of course, it can be fueled by other things. So the Middle East, with the failure of non-aligned socialism and Arab nationalism, or Persian, so the failure in the loss, again, multiple losses against Israel, and all of these sorts of things were a prompt to fundamentalism as well. So there are a number of different factors coming together. If we're talking about Islam, but in general, if we take the Abrahamic faiths, which is where you probably see the largest manifestation of fundamentalism, I mean, this is mostly about a reaction to modernization or syncretism and to secularism. So the stronger the secularism in a way, the stronger the fundamentalist reaction, and kind of seeing that bifurcation. So that's kind of the story of fundamentalism. Now, what I'd say on the Islam front is that certainly the violent jihadist version, and I would even say the Islam post 1970 Islamic revival, the Dawa. My impression is that this has lost force, a bit like how the religious right in America lost force from about the 90s, probably even before George W. Bush's presidency, but certainly afterwards. I mean, I would say that was kind of the high point in terms of the power, the numbers, the organization, and so on, influence in politics. So I think we're actually more on a downslope in terms of Islam and Christianity, in terms of the power of the social and political fundamentalisms associated with, say, Protestant fundamentalism or associated with Islamic fundamentalism. And the Jewish case is a different case, and entirely, I think that's a separate case. It's not diminishing, that's for sure. But there are these different factors that cause fundamentalism to rise and maybe never fall away, though. So, like in the U.S., it may be the case that the Christian coalition and the religious right is no longer taking over school boards and introducing creationism into the curriculum. But what we can certainly see is that the so-called strong religions that demand more of people are holding up better than the Episcopalian and other mainline traditions, which are really declining rapidly.
Hmm. Yeah, and those moderate religions are really in a tough spot because you see the fundamentalist response to the moderates as a sort of, they're not particularly happy with them as they're ceding ground to secularism. And then on the other side of that, the sort of new atheist argument is that moderate religion sort of opens the floodgates to ultimate later extremism because they sort of justify a lot of this sort of this thinking. Is there any way, do you think, that moderate religion can survive in any country, really? Because it seems like it's being attacked from every direction.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think moderate religion is the source of fundamentalist religion. I mean, I think these fundamentalist threads have been there, at least in Islam and in Christianity. I mean, you can select certain passages that you go back in the past and look at the Hanbali, Ibn Taymiyyah in the 14th century. There have been these very austere textual fundamentalists in Islam, and you've had certainly movements in Christianity that have been very much the same. And so there are certainly forebears which can be looked to as exemplars, and I think that is important. I mean, I think for Salafis to be able to look back to Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, to have these exemplars in the past, I think is important. And I also think it illustrates that just innovations and changes, theological changes, can come and go and lead to these upwellings of. Now, of course, you need the right social conditions too, but the potentiality is always there. I wouldn't lay that at the door of the moderate religion, but I think what you can say is that if, as modern Christianity, let's say, or Protestantism, moved in an ecumenical direction, moved in a modernizing direction, and that was seen perhaps as a watering down and a movement towards secularism, which is a spur, arguably, for fundamentalism, because they sense we're losing our tradition, and so we need to sort of draw some bright lines, and so we're gonna say whatever it is, whatever the belief is, we're going to wear this funny set of clothing, and we're not going to practice birth control or whatever it is, to firmly say we are not going along with this modernizing trend. So I'd say it's part and parcel of the modernizing trend. Now, there's also another argument that says an approach to the world, this idea of boiling a religion down to fundamentals, is a kind of Enlightenment modern way of thinking, which tries to say, oh, what's the guts? That's the core of this problem. What's the rational three things that we just need to focus on? And so there's an argument that there's something rational and modern about fundamentalism as well, as distinct from a group of holy men interpreting a very complicated set of passages and accruing all of these commentaries and whatever, as a way of getting away from that to something that is just much more cut and dried, and that's a more modern approach. Or the idea of revolution in this world as being a very modern way of thinking, and so Ayatollah Khomeini, is his innovations were arguably shaped by Marxism to very, and same with Salafi jihadism, is very much shaped by the idea of revolution in this world, which is arguably foreign to, you can make the argument it's foreign to the Islamic tradition.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I'm fascinated by are the political implications of all of this. I think it's safe to say, I could be wrong. Fundamentalism tends to have a very conservative social leaning. Um, would
Yeah.
that be accurate? Okay. And you mentioned in your book that sort of people who consider themselves liberals or Democrats, the idea is that they tend to be much more secular than their conservative counterparts. But it does also seem to be the case that people on the left, liberals, progressives, they overemphasize just how secular they actually are. Because as you said, in many cases, in many of these polls, they tend to believe in an afterlife at higher rates than the other side. Do you think there's also a political component to why people sort of downgrade the religiosity because they want to make sure they appease the people who wear the same colored ties as they like to wear?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely right. I think, and this is what, Putnam. This is where I kind of agree with him. I mean, he sort of said the fall away from religion is sort of a political statement against the religious right and their excesses. And I think there is something to that, but also, he could show, and I've seen other papers where certain religions are just seen as more left wing, like Episcopalianism, and so people would switch from Episcopalianism to being a Baptist, and maybe switch, or being a Southern Baptist, switch to denominations. Lutheran Church Missouri Synod would be, more considered more conservative than, Northern Presbyterian, whatever. So there is an extent to which people will choose denomination based on politics, and of course there's an extent now to which people will report that they have no religion, or that they do have a religion, depending on their political leaning. So if you're Republican, you will say you're a Christian, more than if you're a Democrat. And they've done studies too, where they've tried to count cars in parking lots, as a way of getting a sense of religiosity. And some of these studies, I think, as I recall, show, and a number of other studies have shown, an over-reporting by Republicans and an under-reporting by Democrats of their religiosity. Um, and so it depends which part of the country you are in and what the environment is like. But yeah, politics, and as in it, with everything else, it affects it in the United States.
Hmm. Yeah, politics always poisons the well, as many
Yeah.
people like to say. This is sort of a tangential question, but I can't help but not think of it. It is widely believed, or at the very
Yeah.
least, last time I checked, that overpopulation is not going to be an issue because as countries modernize, they have less children, and you'll see that eventually plateau. But as I'm hearing these arguments, and I'm hearing people make the case that these birth rates sometimes are substantially higher than the secular birth rates, and it's not expected to plateau anytime soon. Does this introduce a new possible problem to the idea of overpopulation?
Yeah. I mean, we haven't sort of talked about the population side of the argument in my book, yet, but just for those who aren't familiar, one part of the argument is that, the religious parts of the world are producing most of the, 97% of the world's population growth. They're producing an increasing share of the immigrants who are, coming to Western countries. So you've got religious people coming into increasingly secular countries. So the gateway immigration cities like London are the most religious parts of Britain, because they have, 2/3 of the people in the churches are not white British. Yeah, that's all true. And so you're getting that demographic kind of return of religion. But also the other part of it is that the world denying strict religions like the ultra orthodox Jews or the Amish are just the two classic cases where you've got with the ultra orthodox the around about six and a half children per woman on average, or thereabouts, maintained in a society with full literacy, access to modern medicine, contraception, whatever. um, that's a deliberate choice. Whereas high fertility in Niger and Mali, you've got a country that has low female schooling, literacy, poor health care, limited industrialization, all of the things. Now, if you imagine, what I would say is if Mali or Niger industrializes and becomes wealthy and there's contraception and all these sorts of things, I'd expect their birth rates to go down below replacement eventually. They will just follow that trajectory.
Mhm.
They're not going to lose necessarily their religion, but they will follow the trajectory of uh, demographic transition that you see elsewhere. Whereas I wouldn't predict that for the ultra Orthodox women, because what they're doing is they are rejecting the demographic transition. That's a difference. They're aware of the transition and consciously rejecting it. Now, what happens is you get groups um, like this. Now, they're quite small, the Hutterites and Amish. If you take the United States, the Amish would be the main group with about, I think it's around five would be the average. I could be wrong on the exact number, but the difference, the issue about the Amish is who have had a doubling of about 20 for 25 years, a doubling of the size of the population. Um, is that back in the late 19th century when they kind of got started, everybody had roughly the same number of children. You kind of had to have that many. Uh, as the surrounding society's fertility has fallen, 4, 3, 2, moving towards 1, 5 now, the difference between 5 and 2 is 2.5. Difference between 5 and 1 is 5. So the multiple, as the rest of the society's birth rate, I mean, the Amish and others have come down a little bit, but the others have gone down a lot more. And so it's the multiplier that really means that, okay, over time, the Amish share of the total population will expand very rapidly. Now it's a very small number. And even with the Mormons, who, there's some evidence that Mormon fertility is they're losing. They've typically had a kind of almost twice as high, or no, not sorry, almost one child's advantage over other white Americans, and that there's some evidence, preliminary evidence, that they're losing that advantage. Whether that is true or not, I have no idea. Long term, we'll have to watch the data, but certainly right now, the legacy of that higher fertility is being borne out in many different ways. One is that Utah's young population is a lot whiter than neighboring states, whereas its old population has a similar racial composition to neighboring states, and that's largely to do with the Mormon birth rate, and it's also religiosity is quite high. Now, whether if we get this Mormon secularization, because the Mormons are kind of one of these groups that is a little bit like the what I call the endogenous growth sects, the Amish, ultra Orthodox, Hutterites, and there's a few other groups, Orthodox Calvinists in the Netherlands, and a few other small groups. It's a little bit like that, but they're also proselytizing, which means they're mixing with the mainstream and accepting the mainstream. So they're susceptible to the pressures from the mainstream. What we might see is a split and a breakaway where a sort of more orthodox group of Mormons break off and lead a more Amish style life. Some of that's happened also in mainstream Protestant fundamentalism. So that, I guess the argument is that, looking way down the line, I mean, there was a book by Paul Moreland called Tomorrow's People, which is saying, well, look, more and more of the world is having below replacement fertility, and you just run the numbers. The question is, who's going to populate the globe? When it seems all these attempts to raise birth rates, they may push it up by 0.1 or 0.2 for a decade or a year, but this doesn't seem like there's any really durable society that's really able to get to that 2.1 replacement level, with the exception of Israel, which there's a whole bunch of things going on in Israel, including strong religiosity and the people who are having high birth rates being strongly religious. But yeah, so one of the arguments is that the groups that are going to be left over when everyone else is depopulated over a very long time span will be these groups that have positive fertility. above the replacement rate. So yeah, I think that that's sort of one of the theses in the book, is that it's hard to imagine with everybody else below replacement. Like right now, the only it's hard to find regular religious attenders, particularly in the Abrahamic faiths, who have below replacement fertility. So almost say a white French woman who attends church regularly, who's a Catholic, will have, about a half child advantage over a white French woman who is non-religious. And we see these numbers over and over and over again. The non-religious have just really, really low fertility, kind of like, between 1 and 1.5, whereas the regular attenders, it's around replacement generally. And so you would draw the conclusion that that could be there would be a larger number of such people in the surviving population of the world after we go through this below replacement fertility wormhole that we may be heading into.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up the Mormons. The Mormons, I've always been fascinated by how they've managed to survive, in which they were viewed originally as an oddity and sort of strange, like, almost in the same way as P.T. Barnum's sort of circus, and they use that to their advantage, to sort of market themselves. My favorite story of them is always going to be the sort of their response to the Book of Mormon musical with Trey Parker and Matt Stone, and they would put up billboards that said, "You've seen the musical, now come read the book." It's always impressive just how these clever religions sort of manage to survive. Um, but going back to the political implications of it that we discussed earlier, I can't help but think if because of immigration and because of birth rates and the age cohorts at which these it, the political implications of this, I wonder, as we've said, they're socially conservative, very different from the liberal California that I'm in.
Hmm.
um I think back just recently the French election in which Macron won over Le Pen, the rise of right-wing populism going on in Western Europe and to some extent here in the United States as well. Now, obviously, there's the very difficult, complex reasons why right-wing populism is increasing. But if the demographics were much more, sort of fundamentalist, strict religious adherence in in France, I often wonder if the election would have gone a different way. Do you think politics will start shaping itself differently if this occurs?
Yeah, the interaction between the kind of religious fundamentalism, let's say, or strict religiosity, and the ethno-nationalist populism is complicated.
Mhm.
So let's just take populist right voting in both the U.S. and in Europe. If you are if you identify as Christian and you're a regular attender, you are less likely to be a populist voter than if you identify as Christian but are not a regular attender. That's especially true in Europe. But even in the US, I think if you put in the right controls, I think it's also true, and I've seen some work in the US suggesting the same thing, that the profile, and certainly in Europe, regular Christian attenders are considered much less likely to be populist right voters than but nominal Christians are more likely than non-religious seculars to be religious right or to be populist right voters. Um, and you see certain things like in the parts of England that have a higher Muslim population, you get a higher Christian identification in the white population, which doesn't mean they're attending more. But so I think that there is something sort of like that's difference between Christian identity and Christian religiosity. I actually think Christian identity bolsters support for right wing populism. Christian religiosity, to some degree, I think dilutes or weakens because Christianity textually is a kind of universalist religion. There is neither Jew nor Greek. You have this welcome the stranger, all this sort of stuff, which is there in the New Testament. And it's kind of, and this is one of the reasons why you get the Pope or the Archbishop of Canterbury here in Britain. They tend to be very liberal on immigration. It was certainly true in the U.S., for example. The Christian Coalition and others were also very liberal on immigration, and that is the key issue for a lot of, essentially for the populist right. So I think to some degree in the US, the eclipse and waning of the religious right is part of the story of the rise of the national populist right. So, oddly enough, if you had a strong religious conservatism, uh, you look at the California 2008 gay marriage proposition that passed with very high, say, minority support. Uh, and as an example of the way that was envisioned was this very sort of trans-ethnic, multicultural, as a kind of multi-ethnic movement of people who were
Hmm.
against gay marriage, and you had Spanish language campaigns, and you had sort of the African American contribution was very strong to this. So that was kind of a different sort of populism from Pat Buchanan first and then Donald Trump. Although I know that clearly a lot of particularly Hispanics and Asians have moved over to Trump, but that's more recent. If we go back to 2016, it was more of an appeal to the white working class. And it was more, it was a little bit more ethnic, if you like, and so I actually think these things are somewhat different. I'm trying to think where they come together. A place like Poland, its right wing populism has a religious inflection, a kind of Catholic, conservative religiousness to it. But that's not true in most other places. Like Hungary, it's not there. France, it's not there. I mean, if you're a traditionalist French Catholic, you have other places that you would tend to go with your vote often. And that's certainly true in a place like Germany. You'd be a Christian Democrat rather than an AFD voter. So, yeah, I think these are actually somewhat different modes.
Mm. Yeah, I wonder. Well, I think you're most likely right. I remember seeing a poll that showed that the highest predictor of someone voting Trump was whether or not you were an evangelical Christian. That seemed to have the highest rates of actually voting positively for Trump. But these very complex sociological
Yeah.
studies, which is why it sometimes gets aggravating because it's not like physics or any of the hard sciences where you can sort of just input a number and get a very clear output
No.
with very little
Very
precision.
tricky. Like you would need to try and distinguish Christian identity from Christian practice. And I still kind of think that the more you get that the reason you're seeing those high correlations, first of all, white Southerners have always been very strong, not always, sorry, let's say since the realignment, and as we get into the sort of 2000s, have been very strong Republicans. And so the denominations that are in the South, which are, I would say, tend to be more the fundamentalist denominations. There are obviously, Episcopalians and other groups there, but evangelical, of course, a lot of those are traditional evangelicals like Southern Baptists, as opposed to Pentecostalists. So there are other correlates of evangelicalism, which I would say may be doing the work. I'm not sure that it's the content of what they're getting. If you look at the very top of the evangelical world, the Christianity Today and the evangelical elite, you will get in the Bible colleges, you will get a significant number of anti-Trump pastors whose worldview is shaped by, oh well, we don't want to alienate our Hispanic and Asian evangelical brethren, and therefore we must be, and so you actually have a sort of split at the very top of these organizations. And I think the more the people are taking their theology and their religion seriously, I think that I'm still of the view that actually reduces support rather than increases support for populism. But the more it's about loss of tradition, loss of identity, the more then you would increase support for populism. But yeah, it's a tricky one to unpick in the U.S. case. I agree. In Europe, it's very clear cut. Like, regular Christian attenders significantly less likely to vote for populist right parties.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I'll be moving to Europe soon so I can get out of this tricky situation over here. But anyways, Dr. Kaufman, we're coming up on the hour, and I want to thank you endlessly once more for this conversation. Very informative, very enlightening. So where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me online, either my website, www.sneps.net, or yeah, I'm on Twitter at EPKAUFM. So thanks very much.
Of course, and I and the links to your books, to purchase your books, will be in the description of the video below, as well as all of your other links. Everyone, go check out Dr. Kaufmann. He's one of a kind. And once more, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Thanks very much.